Hello there, everybody, and welcome to Talks webinar series. What we're going to call it a spring season opener. The title today is "Don't Balk at Plant Diseases, Strike 'em Out." I'm your host, Chris Beatties, and hang on just a second. There we go. I'm your host, Chris Beatties, and today our guest expert will be taking a close look at four of the common spring disease categories: pythium, botrytis, leaf spots, and anthracnose. But you will note plenty of references to America's pastime sprinkled throughout her very interesting seminar today, and that's because our expert is as much of a baseball fan as she is a fan of finding a greenhouse full of diseased plants. And who is she? Well, she is a veteran of my webinars. She is Dr. Janna Beckerman, professor and extension plant pathologist from Purdue University. Welcome, Janna.
Thanks, Chris. I think I'd rather be in a ballpark today. It's gorgeous here.
Let's play too. Hey, but you're down at Purdue, I assume, in your lovely and palatial office today?
Yes, absolutely. Lovely and palatial.
I was worried a little bit about taking a baseball spring opener approach to this webinar, seeing how a couple of days ago the Cubs home opener was snowed out and delayed by a day. But I think the weather has finally broken, at least for a few days. So today, in much of the country, it feels like spring. And of course, that's Janet. This is me, broadcasting from my new studio at #1 Ball Publishing Tower. But before we can play ball, let's do a bit of light housekeeping. And this is for Helene and anyone who can't hear. Well, you'll have to read this. This is just to make sure you've got audio. You need to click the integrated voice conference link at the top. But of course, if you can hear me, you've already done that. So let these folks read that, and then we'll want to hear it. Once Janna gets talking, I'll type them a quick note. Next, well, we've got to thank our sponsor, BASF, for putting the free webinar. Thank you so much, BASF, for that. If you have questions as we go along, use either the chat area or the Q&A area. You'll see both of those on the right side of your screen. If the question is pertinent to what Janna happens to be talking about at the time, I'll field those questions right then. If not, we'll save them for the end. And if it's anything that's really just too complicated to answer, I'm going to give you Janna's contact information where you can reach her 24/7, 365. Right, Janna?
Yep.
All right.
I don't sleep or anything.
You're just thinking about diseases all the time, and baseball and diseases. It's your life. If for some reason you have to leave the webinar halfway through, a customer comes up or something, or you want to see it again or share it with a colleague, your employees, your boss, anyone else, it will be archived probably within a half hour or so of the end of the webinar, and that'll be at the same place you signed up, GrowerTalks.com/webinars. How convenient. I think that's it. Janna, are you all set to step up to the plate?
Raring to go.
All right, take it away.
All right, so we originally started with this as not balking at plant diseases, but really what everybody I think really wants to do is knock them out of the park as far as that's concerned. We just really don't want them around. So with that, if we can go to the next slide. One of the first things, I know we talked a little bit about diagnostics, and all I'm going to say is that a lot of the diagnostics and a lot of photographs can be found in the Plant Doctor apps, and we're just going to go past there. So I want to focus first on the plant disease triangle because, you know, as a plant pathologist, I want you all to picture me standing in front of you, putting that triangle sign up because that's hugely important. And one of the ways of thinking about the plant disease triangle is kind of like the 3 strikes and you're out. And that first strike would be that susceptible host. The second strike would be your conducive environment. And the third strike would be your pathogen. And when you get those 3 strikes, that's when you're out. You can't get out unless really all 3 of those come together and create that plant disease. So another way to look at that, if we can go to the next slide, please, is also how these things impact the plant disease triangle. We talk about having those together, but if you have a resistant host at the very bottom, that actually reduces it. But if your host is susceptible, obviously your disease will increase with the changing environment. If it's, let's say in the case of something like botrytis, cool and wet, in the case of something like pythium, just wet and wet, powdery mildew would be more hot and dry. And then, of course, is the pathogen even there? So all of those things, if you could picture the triangle shifting from, the isosceles to an equilateral, based on whether your pathogen, your environment, or your host is having a bigger impact on those things. So let's go to the next slide. Here's yet another way of thinking about how you can break that disease triangle up and stop disease. So, and we're going to go through this piece by piece, but really quickly, before we get into the fun stuff about all the different fungicides, just quickly, keeping the pathogen away from the host, eradication, quarantines, things like that are hugely important. The other part is mitigating the environment, making sure you don't get those conditions that are actually conducive. It could be as simple as spacing your plants adequately, venting your greenhouse and heating it, not watering at night, is simple things to modify the environment, and of course using a resistant host. So when we look at these in practice, if we can go to the next slide, I've shown this picture a lot of times just because I love it, is because it shows the power of what a resistant host actually, or a susceptible host, the difference that it makes. So here you can see, obviously, we have two peonies, Festivus maxima, and I think the other's Carl Rosenfield. And obviously, the pink one, Carl, is super, super susceptible to powdery mildew, whereas the old standby Festivus isn't quite so susceptible. And nothing else has been done here except for the fact that the genetics is superior in one versus the other. The pathogen is present, and obviously the environment is conducive. If we go to the next slide.
I thought that was a blooming Dusty Miller you had there.
Is it? I just think the white makes the pink pop even more, don't you? It just makes the pink so much more vibrant.
That is powdery mildew, though.
Yes, that is powdery mildew. We won't be talking too much about that one, but got to get the little animations in there. I had no control of the slides. Nope.
You got it? You got the blue arrow now.
I got the blue arrow now. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Yep, hang on. There we go.
There we go. So here's another wonderful example. This is a William Baffin rose, and this was taken at the Minnesota Arboretum, the University of Minnesota Arboretum. And for those of you, everybody knows, the knockout roses, but the Explorer series are really awesome genetics as far as disease resistance is concerned. And you can see in the upper left-hand corner, the difference black spot would make compared to something like a William Baffin rose, which is very black spot resistance. And sometimes that's all it takes to actually mitigate plant diseases, changing what cultivars that you're growing, in addition to how you're growing them. So next slide, please. So let's talk about some real susceptible genetics. I'm sure many of you remember early on with those early yellow petunias when those first came out. They've bred most of those out, but the only difference you could see with the petunias down in the left-hand corner is they were very susceptible to this kind of genetic predisposition to lesions as compared to the petunias on the right. If we go up above to Claridge Druce, which, oh my gosh, who would ever name their child Claridge Druce? Powdery mildew. Most geraniums, true geraniums, hardy geraniums, generally do not have a problem with powdery mildew, but this one obviously is a huge example, although not nearly as good as Rudbeckia goldsturm, where you can see the leaf spot septoria. And of course, nobody has ever grown hollyhock without growing hollyhock rust. I am really proud to say that I've already found my first rust pustule on the hollyhocks in my yard. So for me, that's how I know spring is here. So when we talk about these susceptible genetics, what exactly do we mean? And I was just in a greenhouse last week, and this is just such a great example with the begonia. It's a Rex begonia, escargot, that you can see in the foreground. And they had used the sulfur pots, and they were burning sulfur, which gave somewhat good control for most of the varieties that were fairly resistant to powdery mildew. But for something that's uniquely susceptible, you're going to see a lot more damage, and the sulfur simply was not sufficient to control the powdery mildew on the variety escargot. So what exactly does that mean? Well, it means that you obviously have to up your fungicide game, which we'll talk about, but it also means that the person who gets this plant is probably going to have these problems too. And I was really lucky when I first started my career up in Minnesota. I got to work with a nursery grower named Sam Kedem, and he pretty much didn't treat any of his roses. So when somebody came out to his nursery, they would see what was and wasn't susceptible. And he wasn't going to spray because he figured most people weren't going to spray. And generally, by the time you got there in July, there were a lot of leafless plants, and most people don't want that. So one way to make your work easier on you is by avoiding these super susceptible varieties, because ultimately you're probably going to end up with dissatisfied customers. And at this day and age, dissatisfied customers can take to social media and blame you as opposed to the faulty genetics with some of these varieties that we grow. So here's another example now for strike 2 with the conducive environment. This was work that I did in another nursery where all we simply did, the plants on the right, their holly, were using well water, and the plants on the left were using city water. And there's a huge pH difference here. It isn't that the host was any more resistant, it was more that to the left was a conducive environment. The water was very alkaline, and it was very conducive to Thalasseopsis. Thalasseopsis was present in both plants. Those were the same varieties of plants. One was not more fertilized than the other. So that simple changing of the pH of the water had huge difference in how you could manage your environment there. Obviously, this is a great example of a conducive environment, and you can see that you're out here. You got this one. You know, you see things like this, and sometimes it's accidents, sometimes it's happenstance. A lot of times you can tell there's a conducive environment going on due to the presence of algae. And we see this with poinsettias, we see this with a lot of mums as well. And here you've created something that isn't, you know, there's not any resistance to pythium, but by creating this waterlogged environment and the presence of the pathogen, you can really drive disease, as you've seen here. And, you know, what would a talk be without at least making one reference to downy mildew and a virulent pathogen, because really it is one of the most virulent pathogens that we're contending with nowadays. And this is a photo outside of Chicago. And in the back I have those calocasias that, you know, they say resistant, and they're not really resistant, they're immune. Resistance would be more of your sun patients. And even then it's kind of a stretch. If you take a resistant host and you make a really conducive environment with a lot of disease, it's still possible for your resistance to fail. It just becomes too much. And the fungicide are going to help you, and you're going to end up with poor product. So we've talked about the 3 strikes and you're out. What can you do for a walk? So ball 1, the first one is eradication. And this was probably one of the best dumpster bins I've been in. I know that there's a number of you have really good dumpsters. And yes, you're not a really good plant pathologist unless you dumpster dive. You can evaluate how good the cultural control is in a greenhouse by looking at the quality of the plants that they're throwing away. You know, the best thing you can do as a grower is removing infected parts before the disease spread and keeping a really clean greenhouse. Now, many of you, I'm sure, grow plants outside, and some of the things you can do is trying to make sure that you prevent the spread of disease from neighboring plants or reservoirs. One of the worst examples I've ever seen was an aster grower who had pine trees over near his nursery that were actually the alternate host to a rust, a coleosporium rust, that infected all of his asters. So that can obviously create problems. Having, you know, a juniper host anywhere nearby, about within a mile, could be a huge problem if your nursery is growing crabapples, serviceberries, or hawthorns. That's what I do to create diseases, put those together. So these are just some of the things you can do to try and make sure you prevent these things from happening. Here's a great picture from a grower that I work with who doesn't want to use a flamethrower. I know I do. I don't have any reference to baseball with that, flaming fastball or something like that, but this is actually a good way of eradicating disease as long as the fire is not so hot that you burn the peonies. And this is for cut flower production in peonies. I'm not recommending anybody go out there with their flamethrowers, even though it is a lot of fun, and it just feels really good.
We're going to stop for a quick question because
Awesome.
you've talked about susceptible versus resistant varieties, and Caroline wants to know, how can I find out what varieties are susceptible? I found that usually the variety will say it's resistant, but she hasn't seen any lists of what diseases they may be susceptible to. Nobody wants to advertise that, I guess.
Yeah, and then of course, there's issues regarding what's susceptible where, because different locations have different populations of pathogens. Later on, I can show a list of resistance, but of resistant varieties and annuals and perennials that you can link to, or you could just Google disease-resistant annuals and perennials with Purdue, and hopefully the publication that I wrote with Rosie Lerner will pop right up. But actually, now that you mention it, I will write down a note for myself for disease susceptible, because I do think that is probably useful to help people be aware that if you do grow these plants, whether you're a homeowner or a greenhouse or nursery grower, that you should anticipate bigger problems. So I will start trying to put something like that together.
Very good. Thanks, Carolyn, for the question.
That's a great question. So this has to be one of the cleanest greenhouses I've ever been in. This was down in Florida, and honestly, right after I took the picture, somebody came by and picked up that little bit of plant detritus right underneath the word sanitation. It was incredible. So as you can imagine, they really didn't have a lot of disease problems here. So it was really great to see somebody so successful, but quite honestly, it was so boring for me. But if we go to the next slide as a contrast, obviously this is not the kind of greenhouse that you actually want. They were having problems with, yes, that is what you think it is at the bottom of the screen, with the dogs, with weeds, and obviously you can see that they're having problems with maintenance and everything else. And this is a situation, particularly with those spent blooms, that you're going to be having problems absolutely with botrytis, but also with a variety of other things. So one of the things, actually, a few months ago, I was out on the West Coast, and I always figured everybody had better water than I have. I think we all think everybody has better water than we have, so I thought I'd show you what Purdue University water is like, which is pretty darn appalling. We're pretty high in the soluble salts. You can see it's very alkaline. The calcium and chloride levels are through the roof. Imagine your water. I showed the one picture with the hollies in the nursery, and the simple going to well water versus the reservoir water made a huge difference. But, acidifying your water and working to improve water quality goes so far in managing plant diseases. And I can't really emphasize that enough. I think we all struggle with the quality of our water, and that's probably not going to get any better. But it is something that we can manage with the right acidification process and fertilizers, of course, to mitigate this problem. Of course, it's not only the quality of the water, but where we put the water for Ball 4. If you put it in the right places, you'll be fine. Unfortunately, that's not always possible, through propagation and misting, and of course, space is such a premium. Trying to make sure that you aren't using plants that are super sensitive, or, super dropping flower petals and things like that, messy plants that could actually serve as a reservoir for botrytis when they land, particularly with the wetness. Of course, using something like geraniums, which can actually have a lot of bacterial problems dripping down on something else that might also be susceptible to these bacterial problems. These are all things, obviously, you want to try to avoid or at least minimize. Keeping the leaves dry as long as possible, watering in the morning as opposed to at night, are huge things culturally that you can do to help give you that Ball 4 in the walk. Any questions up to this point?
Actually, let's see. There's two quick ones. One is going to be a little complicated. We have to hold it for the end. It's a bit long.
Okay.
Martin wants to know if you could again tell him what the pH situation was that you pointed out earlier in the two crops where one looked much healthier than the other.
So the pH situation is the well water had a pH, if I recall, it was approximately 5.5 to 6, and that was the natural well water pH, whereas when they used city water, the pH was 8. And so on the left-hand side, if I recall this correctly, that was the city water, and the right-hand side that looked really nice and green and healthy, that was the well water. And we did nothing else to manage the phalaenopsis except look at the two different waters. And as a result, that nursery didn't need the level of fungicides that it once did, and they were producing a much better, much healthier looking product too. So.
All right. Jonathan's got a question too, but I think it's just a little bit too broad. He was asking, in fact, I hope it's not too broad. It's pretty broad. It's going to take some more time. We either save it for the end, or maybe you'll have to deal with that one in private. But otherwise, let's roll on here.
All right, we're going to roll on with the, oops, you jumped ahead. Pythium.
Oops, sorry.
So I just wanted to point out, we have Pythium, and I work on a diversity of crops, and over there's zinnia, which I'm sure all of us are really familiar with. And on the right, what you can see there is actually on ginseng, which was a problem with a grower who was trying to establish a ginseng plantation. And Pythium is in both of these instances. And Pythium is it's a thug. It's everywhere. So if we can go to the next slide, it's like the common cold of plant diseases. And here you can see that example. Here we have some mums, and I know people in another couple months will be gearing up for mum production. So that's why I put this in the first, is we're going to put this early on out there so you know what needs to be fixed before we start roaring into mums. You could see the algae at the bottom corner of the photo there, and of course there's mums that are affected with Pythium. Real quickly, the foliage often changes, you see wilting. A lot of times people will say that rat tail appearance is common for Pythium root rot, and it is, but it's also common for really rotten roots. So don't just assume it's Pythium. A lot of times we end up with Pythium and Rhizoctonia or Pythium and Fusarium. And if you use a fungicide that's specific for Pythium, you might not control all of the problems that you have on whatever crop you're having problems with. So this is Chris and I's great attempt to do some movie stuff. Here's what Pythium looks like. These are actual micrographs on the right of Pythium in the roots, and a close-up, and you can see it's a big gumball-like structure. And next we're going to show you a video, we hope, to show you how Pythium actually spreads in water.
All right. Now this is a first for us. I've never played a video on one of my webinars, but it should work. We tested it. You'll notice on the bottom right of your screen, your little viewer, there's a volume control, and also you can control the view size if you want to. And I hope everybody can hear and see it. Let's see what happens.
It's really exciting.
Oh, it's weird.
So cool. Wow. It adds a lot to that minute and a half, doesn't it?
Is that coming to Netflix? That's all I want to know. I'm going to binge watch the whole series.
You know how to live, Chris.
That's pretty cool. You need to explain that at all? Or
Need
is
to
it pretty
explain it at all, but I think it really, I think unpacks, just to unpack it a little bit, we talk about, the role of water in this disease and how it spreads. We talk about, over-fertilizing. Well, that over-fertilizing is what causes the plant cells to become permeable and leak out, which is what attracts the pythium spores to the cells. And then you could see how the infection occurs and how it destroys the root. And in the process of destroying the root prevents water uptake and the wilting. So I love these videos because I think having, been a student and now an instructor in this, it's a way of actually seeing what's going on instead of just seeing pieces. So hopefully that helps people understand.
Cool. Crystal wants more, and Peter won't sleep for days, he said. So, there you go.
So going back now to media quality, if you're using a medium that has a lot of water holding, I know for a few years ago, rice hulls were the big thing, and it took a while to get that kind of under control because they ended up holding a lot more water than people anticipated, and we had a bit of an uptick of pythium. One of the things that's really interesting or unfortunate is a lot of times people, they want to skip a step, which I totally understand because labor costs are just so high and it's so difficult to find good workers. And I actually had somebody who wanted to put some very small seeds, actually these were hemp seeds, and they wanted to put them in 1-gallon pots and couldn't understand why they could put these tiny little seeds in 1-gallon pots and why they had to keep sizing up their pots. And the reason is that, there's a ratio between the amount of water something holds. And so really make sure that pot size is correct so you give those plants a good start. And then, of course, going back once again, pH does have a role with pythium, as does salt and fertilizer. So here's a lovely picture of pythium blackleg. Pretty much making sure that the medium that you're using has good drainage. Putting plants with similar moisture requirements. I had a hard time deciding if I wanted to show this picture of blackleg, or I have another picture of a geranium in a mixed planter where the geranium is completely pythiumed out, but other plants in there, I think it was lobelia and something else, were happy as clams. And again, the fungus gnats and shore flies are a great way to spread pythium around. When you do have to treat is you want to do this early on at symptom development. This stage is not too far gone, and actually I worked with this grower and we had tremendous success with the fungicide segue and saving his poinsettia crop. You want to take the most severely infected plants and obviously probably get rid of them. You're not going to save them, and they just serve as a reservoir to infect your other plants. And that reduces the spread. But if you start treating those slightly affected, and of course the ones that aren't yet infected, because that's how fungicides work best as preventatives, that's hugely important. So this is, I found this and I love this cartoon, and it's so funny because many of my colleagues also love this cartoon, and I wanted to touch upon this because a lot of times those of us who do this kind of research get accused of using a lot of wiggly words and making things either too complicated. And so I guess the first thing is I want to just talk about why this is complicated and then work our way through it and try and come down to some simplified but not necessarily simple answers as to how to best manage pythium. So the first problem is that there are a lot of different species of pythium. And so the three that I see most commonly are irregulari/debarianum, ultimum, and aphanodermatum. So the one I've yet to encounter is Pythium middletonium, which actually really is a pythium. I do not know if it infects princesses or not. Generally, I would say most of what I see is Pythium aphanodermatum in the hot summer months and Pythium ultimum and irregulari in the cooler spring production cycles. So now I told you we don't have one pythium, we've got like a dozen pythiums. Here's my standard slide to my weasel words here, that nature is very complex. And so what I've tried to do is put together, and thankfully for me, IR4 put together a wonderful project where they actually looked at a bunch of pythiums and a bunch of different fungicides and a bunch of different crop plants. So one of the things you have to realize is that we have results from one test and then we have results of another test, and that when we add more and more information, it doesn't always make the situation clearer. So my example going to baseball is when you talk about the best baseball players of all time, most people immediately think of the home run hitters. But the reality is that there's obviously a lot of very good pitchers who don't get included. And as you can see here, some of the best home run hitters, such as Barry Bonds, are not included on the list of the best baseball players of all time. And of course, nobody can hold a candle to my Jim Tomei, who I remember watching as a kid in the Indian Stadium. So that's why he has a little heart there. My point is that unlike Oprah over there, you don't get a silver bullet. I don't have a silver bullet. What I do have are some answers and hopefully some things that'll help. But I was just actually in a greenhouse last week and they were like, tell me the one thing. And it's like, there isn't one thing. But I can tell you 2 or 3 things. So we're going to get going there. So this horrible slide was a compilation that I put together to show you how complicated this really is. And this is only with 3 different species of pythium and a lot of different fungicides. And at the top are the number of experiments that were actually performed looking at these fungicides. So as you can see, some of them are very few, as little as 3 experiments, and some were as high as 32 experiments. And as you can imagine, the more experiments you perform, the less clear your results are. So if we go to the next slide, what I tried to do was take that into what I observed and my experiences. And all I did was is use a rating scale that one of my colleagues in turf science, turf pathology did, to try and simplify with, I think, his 1 or 2 species of pythium on just golf turf. I think it was bent grass. So anyway, it's still not quite as clear, but hopefully it'll be a little bit better to show you what we have. Next slide, please. And so what I did was tried to summarize and put together, and as you can see, it's still not all that clear, but there's certainly some winners and losers here. So one of the first winners is a product that is being produced by Syngenta that is a tank mix of Heritage and Subdue Max, and that consistently performed really well. Adorn performed quite well as well. And of course, Terrazol, Terrazol is something that we've used for decades, so we have a lot of experience with that. And it's always performed well. I have had very good luck using Empress, but I only have data for Aphanidermatum, and that would be 90% of the pythium stuff that I work with. So this is one way of looking at this. I've also had really good luck with Segway, which is a little different than some of the other people had in the IR4 trials. But again, I mostly work with Aphanidermatum. So how do we do this? This is my cheatiest cheat sheet. Hopefully this helps. I think some of the best fungicides for controlling pythium are probably Terrazol and Segway. I've heard something from Segovis about Segovis being really good, but there is not a lot of data. So I'm putting that one there tentatively. I have had excellent luck with Empress with Pythium Aphanidermatum. And of course, some of the standards, Mycora, Stature, or Vago. Fenstop has done really well on Aphanidermatum, as have Adorn. The groups that are kind of weird, so I put Subdue Max with a asterisk next to it because there are a lot of Subdue Max resistant Pythium Aphanidermatum. And where I'm at, we have a lot of that, so that's not the best option. If that's not your problem, Subdue Max is an excellent fungicide. The phosphorus acid derivatives, and by that, those would be the generics kind of Aliette, generally gave very inconsistent results. So if you want to have it safe, obviously making sure your water is well managed. Of course, I think this photo I took before we ended up getting like 10 inches of rain in August, but obviously keeping the plants well spaced and making sure that surface water drained away goes a long way into making sure that those plants are going to be safe. Any questions there for Pythium?
Not so far.
All right.
One, let me just check down here. Let's see. Do we get another one? Aliette seemed to work well according to the chart. Why was it downgraded to minor league?
So Alliette worked well with some pythiums, not all pythiums. So, and I downgraded it just because in my own personal experience with it with pythiums, I thought it was more suppressive than anything else. So that's why I downgraded it.
All right, excellent.
So now we're going to go to those lovely leaf spots. I figure we're about at the third inning. And one of the things similar to pythiums, at least pythiums are the same genus. When we talk about leaf spots, we're talking about plants all over the kingdom fungi. So if pythium's a problem of too much water on the roots, then leaf spots are a problem of too much water on the foliage. And this is one of my favorite photos. Anyone who lives in the Midwest knows how well any of the Rudbeckias perform. And even Rudbeckia goldsturm, despite the fact that the foliage might look like it was hit with a flamethrower, you can still see it's flowering. And what's interesting in this photo here was the sprinkler system got stuck. It was on a pivot, and to the upper corner on the left, it didn't get any irrigation water overhead, and the one on the right in the foreground was hammered. So the simple fact of just keeping the foliage dry obviously went a long way there. So when we talk about leaf spots, I just showed you the septorial leaf spot, but there's a lot of different leaf spots, and one plant could get multiple leaf spots at the same time, and this is a hosta leaf showing alternaria, which has very different symptoms than the Cercospora leaf spot. One of the things to keep in mind is if your leaf spot looks different, not to treat it how you treated whatever previous leaf spot you were treating, just because different fungi respond differently to different fungicides. Not only that, but a lot of times I've worked with far too many growers who have said that, I keep spraying, but I'm not getting really good control, and then we find out it's a bacterial disease. So that's obviously one of the worst situations that could happen because it's a huge waste of money and it's a loss of crop in addition to unnecessary pollution. Bacterial diseases, for the most part, develop in warm, wet weather. So trying to keep the foliage dry, and of course in the spring it's less of a problem than it is in the summer, but in a greenhouse that's not necessarily going to be true. All right, we're going to do another movie about how that surface wetness actually causes foliar pathogens to infect. Nope, not here in this one, Chris. That was pretty short.
Another doozy.
Yeah. But what I want to show you is how the surface water facilitates the entry of this fungus. Now, not all fungi go through the stomate. Some will actually go through injured tissues, and some will simply force their way in. So something to keep in mind. But if the surface is not wet, that would make it much less conducive to disease.
Okay, Janna, a couple of folks have asked, is there a website or a place where folks can view these and other similar videos?
Unfortunately, no. The videos, these are things that were purchased through APS Press, and I don't think they have them regularly available. I have one or two of these videos included on some YouTube. If you YouTube Purdue Beckerman fungicides, they'll pop up, and some of them are in there, but no, they're not freely available, and I had to pay dearly for that.
We'll just have to wait for next gates to pick them up,
yeah,
as
exactly.
I said.
So somebody asked earlier, this is just the disease-resistant annual and perennials, so you don't end up using Rudbeckia goldsturm, although let's face it, everybody loves goldsturm anyway. But it's a good way of identifying some of the more resistant varieties, at least for the Midwest. So what I wanted to show here was some of the difference, and this was a rose black spot trial that I did a while ago. And we used 3 different variety of roses, Chrysler Imperial, which is very susceptible, Morden Blush, which is I believe, out of the Canadian series, but the Morden station. But it actually was susceptible and nearly wild. Nearly wild, we call nearly dead around here because the rose anthracnose can be so severe. And all I want to show here is that, we used a variety of different fungicides, and all we could do was minimize the impact of disease. We couldn't eradicate it or prevent it completely, and that the very susceptible variety, like Morden blush there, even using really strong fungicides, we weren't able to get the same level of control as nearly wild by, is naturally resistant to black spot. So that's just something to keep in mind. Okay, so the next couple slides I'm going to do is show some area under the disease progress curve, AUDPC. And I realize that most of the time we never explain what that actually is. So the disease progress curve is just the plotting points of how much disease you have at certain dates in time. And what you could see there on September 7th is that there is some break apart within those, but how far apart the orange, the diphane, is from the diphane plus coside isn't very big. But if you look at the differences, the area, instead of just the actual score, you end up with different values. So if we go to the next slide, what you can see here is this was some really good work done by Fulya at Tennessee State, and she found this was such a huge problem, Cercospora leaf spot on hydrangea, and she ended up getting excellent control with Orchestra and very good control, statistically similar control using Mural. What's interesting is she got very good control with Regalia, which is a OMRI approved product, I believe, and a biological. It stinks to high heaven, but it is very effective. So if somebody wanted to go that green route, that would be a possibility there. Here's another trial that was actually done on Goldsturm. I've done several, and they've worked or haven't worked, which is frustrating because I know I've had really good results with Heritage. With any of the 7-Elevens, you get excellent control, and this is work that Kirk did up in Michigan showing, the same result, that they got excellent control using Orchestra and Pageant for control of septoria leaf spot. One of the things that's nice about using the 7-Elevens as opposed to your DMI fungicides like Strike, Torque, Trinity, Tourney, Balatin, is you don't get the plant growth regulator effect. And, sometimes the plant growth regulator effect for foliage plants is actually good. You can see that on the left, which is the dark green leaf of the hazel. And then on the right, the untreated, naturally kind of yellow-green leaves of what normally is a hazelnut or a filbert. Once again, our disease efficacy assessment, where I try to summarize this, and I just have to warn you, this turned out, this is like one of those things I wish I wouldn't have started, so prepare yourself, it's ugly. So in trying to simplify this, there's a lot of different leaf spots, and there's very inconsistent performance. And so hopefully you could see there that Medallion sometimes performed really well with certain leaf spots and didn't perform well at all with other leaf spots. The same actually could be said of Eagle or any of the DMIs. Consistent control, for the most part, was found in numerous studies through using Daconil, using any of the 7-Elevens, sometimes with surfactants, and also just the straight strobies, which would be Compass and Heritage. The old fungicide, Cleary's 3336, I'd start there a lot for managing diseases, and if it works great. The problem is it's resistant, which is why I have that broken bar and have it down at 1. If you have resistance, it's not going to work at all. So here was my attempt to try and clarify things a little bit further. And one of the things I just realized is Heritage does an excellent job on Alternaria. And so I don't know, I think the yellow must have gotten sent to the back, but that's something to keep in mind. For the most part, what you see, though, is, Torque, tebuconazole gave excellent control. Mural and Pageant and Orchestra all gave really good control. Chlorothalonil, when they were looking at Cercospora control in several studies, was mediocre to good. And then finally, when we look at scab and black spot, and I do a lot of work on apple scab, and I've played around with black spot, and it's really important to add a surfactant, such as capsule, when trying to get control of black spot. Anyone who works with a lot of roses knows that they all have different surfaces. Some are rugose, some are very glaucous, and how you get that fungicide to stick is really important, and something like capsule has worked really well. Good old 3336 used to be great for black spot as long as you don't have resistance. If you do, then it's not going to work. So summarizing that up into the Cheatiest cheat sheet, there you can see some of the Daconal is always a good rotation tool for black spot control. All of the 7-Elevens work well. The DMI's Eagle I probably use the most. It's a little stinky, but it works really well. For variety black spot, apple scab, in addition to rusts and powdery mildews, it does have a DMI effect, though, however slight. I have played around with a lot of the biologicals, and if you're willing to spray every 5 to 7 days, you can get really good control, but most people aren't willing to do that. When I look at just scab and black spot, again, making sure that you actually add the right surfactant. And then one of the things just to add for those of you in nursery production is to be really careful using heritage if you're using that on any sort of crabapple. I've seen firsthand what azoxystrobin does to apples, and it is not pretty. If you are going to use it, make sure you add Latron B. It performs so much better. And if you're using Pageant or Orchestra, adding capsule will improve the performance as well. So a lot to unpack there. Any questions?
Not so far.
All right, we're going to just go into
the
wowing
them.
Innings. Oh, yeah. 7th inning stretch, botrytis. So it doesn't get much better than that, does it? So botrytis is just a perpetual problem. I've never been somewhere where you can't find botrytis. If we go to the next slide, it's not just a problem in greenhouse, it's a problem in nursery, it's a problem in storage. You could see that's botrytis actually covering the roots. And this was a greenhouse over to the right where it was a huge problem on hydrangea, even a problem on hosta if the conditions are cool and wet and foliage is not able to dry and sanitation isn't all that good. So botrytis. So I tried to simplify botrytis, and as you can see, the simplest is botrytis sucks, which we all know, and that it's a pain to manage. But one of the questions you need to ask is how many botrytis pathogens are you managing? And the reality is that most of what we're managing is going to be botrytis cinerea. But the reality is if you're growing a lot of bulb crops or peonies, for example, you do have several other botrytis that actually respond differently to some fungicides. So the good news is 586 out of 596 botrytis species or hosts supported botrytis cinerea, and there's only a few exceptions. But if you're growing those exceptions, you want to be aware of the fact that management might need to be modified. So here I have examples. I'm sure all of us are more familiar with cinerea than we need to be. In iris and lilies and things, that's where you'll see those lovely elliptica tulips. You'll get the tulipy, and the peonia is right there on the peony. And I would like to proudly point out that 3 of the 4 there, except for the cinerea, were all from my backyard. I do take my work home with me. So plant pathologists have to show a life cycle slide. Generally, the key points here, if you look over at about 9 o'clock, is that sclerotium, which is overwintering, which is why it's so important to clean your greenhouse to try and stop that. That said, it's almost impossible, and those sclerotia are going to germinate and produce a huge amount of spores. It is a prodigious number of spores. If you look at your pinky, you could easily fit about 600,000 spores in that. I'm just doing another trial right now on botrytis, and I was pouring some detergent water onto the plate to take care of it, and I was like watching the spores kind of go poof and spread everywhere, and that's exactly what's happening in the greenhouse too. And it's going to invade everything, detritus and healthy plants alike. I love this picture. keep in mind that you can't manage botrytis just with cultural controls. You also can't manage botrytis just with fungicides. You really have to put these things together. Reducing humidity is hugely important, and venting your greenhouse multiple times during the course of the night actually saves money. I know it's painful. The good news is heating prices aren't what they were a few years ago. Just do it. Again, here's the efficacy assessment, and if we go to the next slide. So here, I just want to really quickly touch upon one other thing where we talk about significant, because I think that gets confused by a lot of people that, what's statistically significant doesn't necessarily mean it's significant to you or me or anybody else. Here we have values that are statistically significant compared to the control, which means that, I had almost 12 leaves out of 12 leaves per 6 plants, which meant each of 6 plants had at least 12 leaves infected, versus the fungicide treated that had much less. All of them were able to significantly control disease, but I suspect that many of you would prefer broad form or decree as opposed to, let's say, Serenade ASO for disease control. So this gets ugly, but I tried to clarify it a little bit here. And so Medallion, which generally doesn't perform on a lot of leaf spots, it's absolutely appalling on Entomosporium, actually does quite well on botrytis. Decree is one of the standards that we use for all of our fungicide trials. Fungicide that I'm not a big fan of, Polyoxin D. This would be a firm, endorse. I think it's also called PhD. Actually does great on botrytis. It doesn't do particularly well on other leaf spots. Daconil is a great rotation product. The QOIs perform quite well. I think resistance, if it isn't already an issue, will be soon. Palladium also does quite well on this. Orchestra, Gary Chasteger did some wonderful work up in Washington State looking at different bulb crops, and he ended up getting excellent control with all of his bulb crops, so he was looking at all 4 botrytises. Cleary's 3336 used to be the standard for botrytis until resistance developed. Again, your mileage may vary on that. Same with Chipko, which is the iprodiazone. One of the things to keep in mind is the residue. I would say one of the best ways to reduce the residue is including capsule. I've also used Silhouette, and that also reduced the residue. It also makes your tractor shiny, just saying. If you are going to use a biological under low disease pressures, they do work. So if you have a really clean greenhouse and you just want to prevent botrytis from getting a foothold, and you're willing to spray every 5 to 7 days, I think you'll get really good results with Serenade ASO. You'll also get good results, maybe better results with Serenade Opti, but I think the level of residue is probably unacceptable for most things. So tedious cheat sheet, I've had great results with botrytis control, and I'm doing yet another trial with Orchestra and broad form. Almost as good, just about as good. Statistically speaking, pretty similar, but Orchestra and broad form always score a bit higher. Our Mural and Pageant. Decree is the standard that we all go against, as is Daconil. Daconil you use early on to reduce the risk of resistance, and then you don't have to worry about the residue, and then finish up with an Orchestra or a broad form. Works really well. I know Medallion is hit and miss. Some people, obviously, you don't want to use it on your geraniums, as people have reported problems with that, and other people have reported other problems with Medallion. I have not personally seen those, but I believe everybody, so I put that warning there. So here you can see, well-spaced poinsettias, no botrytis, no disease control. They are totally safe. All right, we're going into the 9th inning, home stretch, and we're looking at Colototricum and anthracnose. And there's a lot of different anthracnoses. They're not all caused by Colototricum, but most are. And here you can actually see in that bottom right-hand corner what a Colototricum is. It has those nice black horse hairs called CD, and they produce tons and tons of spores. And this is taken right outside my office. Another other anthracnose that could be right outside my office, although this photo is in Iowa, is sycamore anthracnose, which is a huge problem. Now, none of us are going to be spraying all the way up the top of the sycamore trees, but I like this photo because you can see how horrible sycamore anthracnose actually is. But even sadder is the fact that in the understory, all those green trees are ash, and now, at least in Indiana, because of emerald ash borer, we don't even have those anymore. So it's interesting. My work with Calotropicums are mostly apples, so I just want to make that really clear. I have worked on ivy and a couple others, but I would say I've done at least a good dozen plus trials, but it's mostly been on apples here. I mentioned the Calotropicum causes many, but not all. The other anthracnose that I do a lot of work on is the rose anthracnose, which is pretty much only a problem in the Midwest. Those of you on either coast, count your blessings, I guess. I would have to say one of the biggest things to keep in mind when trying to control anthracnoses is you really can't stretch your spray schedules, and your tightest control and your best control is going to be with that 7-day spray interval compared to an every other week one. So when I tried to break this down, I've had excellent results with Orchestra. I know Aaron Palmatier, when he was at Florida, had some wonderful results with Sansevieria that we see over there. Medallion has performed inconsistently on this one, but sometimes it's been very good. Daconil, not the best. One of the things I did put in there that I know we don't normally use in the greenhouse or in the nursery is Mancozeb. And for anthracnose, in the apple orchard, nothing works better. For grapes, nothing works better. Talking to the turf guys for their anthracnose, nothing works better than Mancozeb, and that might be something to consider putting into your rotation. It is a little unusual, though I do understand. 3336, when it does work, there is a lot of resistance out there, would be something to do. And I suspect Eagle probably has a role in controlling this disease as well. This is from my apple work and some other things, but I'll be playing with that a little bit in the future. Polyoxin D was absolutely terrible for Calotropicum control, as was several other fungicides like Trinity, Palladium, and Medallion in that instance there. So Medallion performed either really well or really poorly depending on the anthracnose. Here we have a summarized concert, the same thing. It either performed really well or really poorly depending on what anthracnose they were dealing with. Clearies, you could say the same thing depending if it was resistant or not. Orchestra, Daconil, and Mancozeb are things that I've used reliably and had excellent control. The straight QOIs, that would be Heritage, Insignia when it was available, Compass and Disarm, did not perform as well as the 7-Elevens. So. All right, that's a lot of fungicide information. How do you keep them managed and rotated? This is supposed to be updated in about 2 more weeks, where I have all of the newer fungicides like the Orchestras, the Palladiums, and things like that included in there. So keep your eye open for that. And then if you had questions regarding mobility, you could always refer to that other reference as well. So changing from baseball back to understanding statistics, your relationship status with fungicide should be it's complicated, because it is. I wish I could give you a silver bullet. That would be so freaking awesome, but I think really all there are silver-tongued answers, and they're not particularly right. We all have our favorite fungicides, and just keep an open mind, I think, regarding that, because I've been surprised. I'm sure everybody's been surprised by something that they didn't expect to work, or something to not work, or something working that shouldn't work. So we're all learning, and again, part of the problems we have are the diversity of the crops. It's not like we're just working with 3 different types of turf grasses or 2 different types of apples. We have hundreds of crops, and so it's going to be complicated. Anybody who tells you otherwise is a silver-tongued liar.
Well said. and let me say on behalf, Janna, of everybody out there, thanks for the cheatiest cheat sheets.
Did you like the cheatiest cheat sheets?
I got to say, as a former grower, that spoke to me. Some of those other things, you really have to stay on top of these things, and you can't treat disease management lightly. I think that was probably my problem. That's why I'm now a journalist and I'm no longer a grower. Probably. But anyway, we do have a few questions.
Excellent.
Let's go ahead and tackle these. Maria is referring back to your botrytis graph and wanted to know why Pageant was located to the left of the bar.
I ran out of
room.
I ran out of room.
That was her first guess. She also wondered if were you trying to convey something about that?
No, I wasn't trying to convey anything other than I ran out of room.
There you go.
I guess one of the things I would add is that Pageant, we had, Pageant was the first 7-Eleven that was available to us, and now I would say we have our second generation 7-Elevens in the form of Mural, broad form, which will be available this summer, and Orchestra. And so Pageant is still very good, and if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But Orchestra and broad form, I think, have a higher rate of QOI. I know Orchestra does off the top of my head. And so you might get better control if you're having slightly less control. And the risk of resistance with the QOI fungicides and botrytis, well, botrytis in anything is high, so something to keep in mind.
And for those who missed it, the 7-Eleven refers to two different active ingredients, one from the 7 category, one from the 11 category, right?
Yes, the 7 category is the SDHI fungicides that all have horrific names, and the 11s are the ones that we're familiar with. These were the Heritage, the Insignias, the Empress, the Compass, and way back in the day, the first one was Cygnus, chrysoxymethyl.
There you go. All right, Nicholas wants to know, any experience with growers noticing a lack of effectiveness of Decree? We feel it's losing its luster.
I've wondered about that, and if you would be so kind as to send me, just hang on and I'll get you my email address or anything else, because I would like to test that. I wouldn't be surprised. Botrytis is well known to have resistance to a variety of different fungicides, and I know in the grape production sphere and the strawberry production sphere, we do have resistance, so it could be that you really do.
All right. Deborah wants to know if you can explain the slide that said excess salts cause roots to leak.
Yes. So if you picture your root and you picture it in salts, the cations and the anions, so if we say salt is simply sodium chloride, the sodium chloride on the outside of the root actually draws moisture out. And in drawing that moisture out, it's also drawing out sugars and other solutes. And so that's what I mean by leaking. And it's just because of the, I hate to use fancy words, osmotic differential. So the moisture on the outside is, because it's so higher in salt, it pulls the moisture on the inside out.
Just like when you salt eggplant before frying.
That's an excellent example. I wish I would have thought of that.
Don't salt the steak too early or you'll dry it out. Just right before you grill it. Let's see. Adam has a question about regalia. It says the label says it's for use on edibles and field crops with no ornamentals listed. Can it be used on Cercospora, on hydrangea, Cercospora on hydrangea in a greenhouse setting?
That is a very good question, and I would have to look up the label. Yeah,
he adds that he's found that many biofungicides don't have ornamentals listed, but many of the diseases he's aiming to control are on there.
Mm-hmm. So that's a good question. Honestly, I would be scared to death to use Cercospora or regalia in the greenhouse because of the smell. You might knock yourself out or make yourself sick. If you could shoot me an email, I will look into that. I might have made a mistake there. It was, again, just repeating some of the work done in a trial, and I should have probably checked if that was labeled or not.
All right. Well, here's that contact information. There's Janna's lovely smiling.
Yes, Adam, please send me an email, and we'll clarify that.
Easy. Janna at Purdue.edu, and there's even a phone number so you can chat, which oftentimes is the good way to go back and forth. And that said, if you want to go back to any of the points of this webinar, you can do that probably within the next half hour or 45 minutes or so. I should have it up on the archive page, which is growertalks.com/signed up. And share it with your friends.
Thank you, everyone, for spending your lunch with me.
And I also want to thank our sponsor one more time, BASF. They've got, gosh, I think we have 4 more webinars we're planning on doing through the rest of the year. So stay tuned for these and others. I'll promote them as best I can. So that said, for Janna and her Purdue Boilermaker baseball team, who are currently 15-13, I looked it up, and all of the Cubs and White Sox fans at Ball Publishing who secretly check the scores during important meetings, this is Chris Beatty saying, so long, everybody.